The wind cut through Mark's jacket as he stepped out of his truck, his boots crunching against the frozen gravel. He pulled his scarf higher over his mouth, shielding himself from the biting cold. The snow had started falling again, dusting the road in a thin white layer. He had been driving home from a long shift at the hardware store, exhausted and ready to collapse into bed. But something had caught his eye, a small, dark shape in the ditch, barely visible under the dim glow of his headlights. At first, he thought it was just a pile of trash, maybe an old jacket someone had tossed aside. But then it moved. Mark hesitated for only a second before grabbing his flashlight from the glove compartment. He stepped carefully toward the ditch, his breath visible in the freezing air. As he got closer, the shape became clearer: a puppy. A German shepherd, no older than a couple of months, curled up into a tight ball, shivering violently. "Hey, buddy," Mark murmured, lowering himself to one knee. He aimed the flashlight away, not wanting to startle the little thing. The puppy's fur was matted with ice, its ribs faintly visible beneath its thin coat. Someone had dumped it here, left it to die in the cold. Mark swallowed hard, his gut twisting with anger. Whoever had done this hadn't even bothered to leave the pup with a chance. No blanket, no food, just tossed away like garbage. The puppy flinched as Mark reached out, its body tensing. It didn't growl, didn't bark, just stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. "It's okay," Mark said softly, pulling off his gloves. His fingers were instantly numb, but he needed the pup to feel warmth, not rough fabric. He extended his hand slowly. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The puppy didn't move. Mark could see it debating whether to trust him or not. He knew better than to grab it outright. It had to come to him on its own. A gust of wind swept through the trees, shaking loose more snow. The puppy whimpered, tucking its nose against its paws. Mark couldn't leave it here, not in this cold. "All right," he murmured, shrugging off his jacket. It was a stupid idea, he'd freeze without it, but he wasn't about to let this little one die. He carefully draped the jacket over the puppy, wrapping it gently before lifting it into his arms. The pup didn't fight him. It was too weak, too cold. Its small body trembled against his chest, but a tiny sigh escaped as it sank into the warmth. Mark hurried back to his truck, opening the passenger door and settling the puppy onto the seat. He turned the heat up as high as it would go, rubbing his hands together before gently placing them over the pup's small body. "You're okay now," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the puppy or himself. The drive home was slow, the road slick with ice, but Mark kept glancing at the pup beside him. It hadn't moved much, just curled deeper into his jacket, its breathing shallow but steady. When he finally pulled into his driveway, he wasted no time getting inside. His house wasn't much, just a small cabin on the edge of town, but it was warm. He set the puppy down on the couch, then grabbed an old towel from the laundry pile. Carefully, he started drying off the damp fur, his hands working gently but quickly. The puppy let out a small whine, but didn't resist. Mark sat back, exhaling. "What am I gonna do with you?" The puppy blinked up at him, its ears twitching slightly. It was still scared, still unsure. Mark ran a hand through his hair, glancing at the clock. It was nearly midnight. He should take the pup to the vet first thing in the morning. But for now, it needed warmth, food, and rest. He went to the kitchen, rummaging through his fridge. He didn't have dog food, but he found some leftover chicken and a carton of broth. He heated the broth slightly, then tore the chicken into small pieces, placing it in a bowl. When he brought it back, the puppy sniffed the air but didn't move. Too weak. Mark scooped up a small piece of chicken and held it near the pup's nose. "Come on, you gotta eat." The puppy hesitated, then finally took the food from his fingers, chewing slowly. "That's it," Mark encouraged, relief washing over him. It took time, but the puppy ate little by little. Once it finished, Mark set the bowl aside and grabbed a blanket, wrapping it around the small body. He sat on the floor beside the couch, watching as the puppy's eyes started to droop. "You're safe now," he murmured. The pup didn't respond, but as it drifted into sleep, its body relaxed just a little more. Mark leaned back against the couch, exhaustion finally settling in. He hadn't planned on bringing home a stray tonight, but as he looked at the tiny creature curled up in his jacket, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. Whoever had left this pup in the ditch had given up on it, but Mark wouldn't. Mark woke to the sound of restless movement. He blinked, adjusting to the dim light filtering through the curtains. The weight of exhaustion still clung to him, but the memory of last night sharpened his focus. The puppy. He pushed himself upright, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the floor. The small bundle of fur was shifting beneath the blanket, its body tense. As Mark moved, the pup flinched, shrinking back against the couch cushion. He exhaled slowly. The fear was still there, deep and ingrained. Mark stood, stretching briefly before heading to the kitchen. He needed coffee, but more importantly, the pup needed food again. He found some bread and peanut butter safe enough for a dog in a pinch and prepared a small offering. Stepping back into the living room, he sat on the floor again, placing the food nearby without forcing it. The puppy's nose twitched, but it didn't move just yet. Mark rubbed a hand over his face. He had to get to the vet today, no putting it off. After a few minutes, the pup hesitantly sniffed the food. Mark remained still as it took a cautious bite, chewing slowly. That was progress. By the time Mark pulled on his boots and grabbed his truck keys, the puppy was sitting up, more alert than before. He grabbed one of his old sweatshirts, folding it into a makeshift bed in a cardboard box. When he approached, the pup stiffened but didn't try to flee. Carefully, Mark lifted the small body, settling it into the box. It didn't fight him, just let out a quiet breath. The vet's office was across town, a small clinic Mark had only been to once before when his neighbor's dog had been hit by a car. He wasn't sure what to expect this time. Snow piled along the edges of the road, the salt-stained pavement slick in some places. The heater in the truck fought against the cold, but Mark still felt the chill in his bones. The clinic parking lot was mostly empty when he pulled in. Mark grabbed the box and stepped inside, the warmth of the building immediately pressing against his skin. A woman at the front desk glanced up, her expression shifting from tired indifference to quiet concern. Mark cleared his throat. "Found this little guy last night, needs a checkup." She nodded, motioning toward a clipboard. "Fill this out, I'll let Dr. Evans know." Mark sat in one of the chairs, balancing the box on his lap. The puppy peeked up at him, ears twitching at the unfamiliar sounds. Minutes later, a man in his 50s stepped into the waiting area, his white coat slightly wrinkled. "Let's see what we've got," Dr. Evans said, leading Mark into an exam room. Mark set the box down on the table, stepping back as the vet leaned in. The puppy tensed but didn't snap, though its body language screamed discomfort. Dr. Evans worked methodically, checking the pup's weight, teeth, and paws. When he pressed gently along its ribs, he frowned. "Malnourished," he murmured, "but no broken bones, some frostbite on the paws but nothing severe." Mark folded his arms. How bad off is he? The vet sighed. "He's lucky you found him when you did. A few more hours in the cold, and he wouldn't have made it." Mark swallowed, the weight of those words settling in his chest. Dr. Evans continued his exam, checking the pup's ears and eyes before finally leaning back. "He's young, maybe 10 weeks, likely dumped." Mark clenched his jaw. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his blood simmer. The vet scribbled something on a chart. "He needs regular feeding, hydration, and warmth. I'll give you a dewormer and some antibiotics in case of infection." Mark nodded, absorbing the information. Dr. Evans glanced at him. "You planning on keeping him?" The question caught Mark off guard. He hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd just been focused on getting the pup safe, on making sure he survived the night. "I don't know," he admitted. The vet smiled faintly, setting down his clipboard. "Well, if you do, he'll need vaccinations in the next couple of weeks. For now, just take it slow. Let him come to you." Mark nodded, reaching for his wallet as the vet stepped out. When the receptionist handed him the bill, he barely glanced at it before paying. Back in the truck, the pup curled deeper into the sweatshirt. Mark sat for a moment, rubbing his hands together. Maybe it should have been an easy decision. Drop the pup at a shelter, let someone else take over. But the thought of leaving him behind felt wrong. Mark sighed, turning the key in the ignition. "Guess we'll figure this out," he muttered. The puppy didn't answer, but as they drove home, Mark caught a glimpse of something different in those dark eyes. Not trust, not yet. But maybe the beginning of it. Mark pulled into his driveway, the truck groaning slightly as he shifted it into park. The snow had stopped falling, but the sky remained heavy, a dull gray that mirrored the exhaustion settling deep in his bones. He glanced at the passenger seat. The puppy was curled into the sweatshirt, motionless except for the subtle rise and fall of its breathing. He hadn't realized until now how much tension had been sitting in his chest, waiting for the vet's assessment. The pup was weak, but would make it. That was more than Mark could have hoped for the night before. He climbed out and carefully lifted the box from the seat, mindful not to jostle the small body too much. The cold air bit through his jacket as he crossed the short path to the front door. Inside, the warmth of the house was a welcome relief. He set the box down near the couch, hesitating before pulling the sweatshirt back. The puppy blinked up at him. There was still uncertainty in its gaze, but the raw panic had dulled. Mark took that as progress. Without a word, he moved into the kitchen. The vet had said small meals, nothing too heavy. He grabbed a can of plain chicken from the cupboard, draining it before placing a few pieces in a shallow dish. When he returned to the living room, the pup hadn't moved. He crouched down, setting the dish just within reach. Nothing. Mark exhaled, leaning back on his heels. The hesitation made sense. It had spent who knew how long fending for itself, learning that humans weren't to be trusted. That kind of fear didn't vanish overnight. Minutes passed in silence before the pup stretched its neck just enough to sniff the food. Mark stayed still, watching as it considered whether to take the risk. Then, slowly, it licked at the chicken, chewing cautiously. Mark felt something loosen in his chest. He pushed himself up, letting the pup eat in peace. He needed to figure out the next steps. He told the vet he wasn't sure about keeping it, but now, standing in his own home with the small creature curled in his sweatshirt, the thought of taking it to a shelter sat wrong in his gut. He wasn't good at this. He didn't have a history of rescuing animals, didn't have the kind of lifestyle that made pet ownership easy. His days were long, his house quiet, his routines set. But none of that seemed to matter as much as it should. The sound of slow chewing filled the room. Mark sat on the armrest of the couch, watching the pup finish its meal. When the dish was licked clean, the little body settled again, exhaustion winning out. The house fell into stillness once more. Mark ran a hand down his face. He needed supplies. A bed, proper food, maybe a collar. He hesitated at that last thought. It felt too permanent, too much like a commitment he wasn't sure he was ready to make. But he couldn't leave the pup with nothing. He grabbed his keys again, pulling his coat tighter as he stepped back into the cold. The drive to the pet store was short, but the whole way there, his thoughts tugged in two directions. This was temporary, it had to be. But as he walked through the aisles, picking out a small bed, a bag of food, and a single chew toy, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing an invisible line. Back home, the pup was right where he'd left it. He set the new bed near the fireplace, arranging the blanket inside. The chew toy went next to it, though he doubted it would be touched anytime soon. The pup lifted its head slightly as Mark sat down on the floor nearby. He didn't reach out, didn't say anything, just sat. Minutes passed. Then, cautiously, the puppy shifted. It was small, barely noticeable, but Mark caught at the slight lean forward, the testing of space between them. It didn't last long. The pup settled back into the sweatshirt, but something had changed. The moment wasn't big, wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than anything. He wasn't sure what came next. But for the first time, he wasn't in a hurry to figure it out. Mark sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from his untouched coffee. His hands rested on the chipped wood, fingers tapping absently. The house was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint sound of the fire crackling in the living room. He glanced up, eyes landing on the small shape curled in the new bed he'd set up the night before. The pup was awake, but unmoving, ears flicking slightly at the faint noises from outside. Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over the stubble on his jaw. He needed to get to work in an hour. The thought of leaving the dog alone in the house didn't sit well with him, but he didn't have much choice. He wasn't even sure if the pup would leave that bed while he was gone. It hadn't explored, hadn't shown any curiosity. It was cautious, withdrawn. Mark exhaled, standing and walking over. He crouched a few feet away, not pushing too close. The pup's dark eyes flicked to him, wary but not as wide with fear as before. He studied the small frame. It was still too thin, but at least it had eaten something. That was a start. Finally, he spoke, voice quiet. "I have to head out for a few hours." The pup didn't react, just kept watching. Mark ran a hand through his hair. "I'll leave some food out, water too." He hesitated, glancing around the room. "I'll be back later." The words felt strange leaving his mouth. He wasn't sure if they were for the dog or himself. He pushed himself up and grabbed his coat off the rack. As he stepped toward the door, he looked back one last time. The pup hadn't moved. Mark sighed and stepped outside, locking up behind him. The hours at the hardware store dragged. Usually, he didn't mind the routine stocking shelves, helping customers, handling the occasional repair consultation, but today, his thoughts kept drifting elsewhere. He caught himself checking the clock too often, his mind circling the same question. Would the pup still be there when he got back? It wasn't like the dog had anywhere to go, but the idea of returning to an empty house made his stomach twist. By the time his shift ended, he was out the door before anyone could stop him for small talk. The drive home felt longer than usual. When he pulled into the driveway, he hesitated for a moment before stepping out. The cold bit at his skin as he unlocked the door and pushed it open. He let out a slow breath as he stepped inside. The pup was still curled in the bed, head lifting slightly at the sound of the door. Mark shut the door behind him, shrugging off his coat. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting, but relief settled in his chest nonetheless. He walked into the kitchen and checked the bowl he'd left out. Some of the food was gone, not much, but enough. Progress. He moved carefully as he grabbed the kettle, filling it for tea. As he waited for the water to heat, he glanced toward the living room again. The pup was watching him, not as tense as before, but still uncertain. Mark leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "You stayed." The pup's ears twitched, but that was it. Mark shook his head, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Guess that means you don't hate it here." He didn't expect a response, but something in the dog's expression had softened, just a little. Maybe that was enough for now. Mark shifted the grocery bags onto the counter, rubbing the cold from his hands. The trip to the store had been quick, just a few essentials, more dog food, a sturdy bowl, and a cheap leash. He hadn't planned on buying the last one, but as he stood in the pet aisle, staring at the rows of collars and leashes, something in him had settled. This wasn't temporary, he knew that now. He glanced toward the living room. The pup who he had started calling Duke was lying near the fireplace. Not in the bed anymore. That was new. Instead, he had stretched out on the floor, head resting on his paws, eyes following Mark's movements. A month had passed since that first night. A month of slow, careful steps. Of building something neither of them had expected. Duke wasn't the same fragile, trembling creature Mark had found in the snow. He was still cautious, still quiet, but there was a weight to him now, something solid and real. Mark unpacked the supplies, setting Duke's new bowl next to the water dish. He tapped the edge lightly, just enough to draw attention. Duke lifted his head, ears tilting forward. After a moment, he stood, stretching before making his way over. That, too, was new. The hesitation was still there, but it wasn't fear anymore. Just habit. Mark stepped back, letting Duke sniff the bowl before he poured the kibble in. No hesitation this time. Duke ate steadily, tail flicking slightly as he chewed. Mark leaned against the counter, watching. The change had been slow, but it had happened. At first, Duke had barely moved from the bed. Then, he had started watching Mark more, following him with his eyes even when he didn't approach. After that, little things, the way he would inch closer when Mark sat on the floor, the way he lingered near the kitchen doorway when meals were being made. Then, last week, Duke had taken food from Mark's hand for the first time. Not a big moment, not something dramatic, but Mark had felt it. The shift. And now, here they were. Once Duke finished eating, he licked his lips and turned, stepping toward Mark. He stopped a foot away, looking up at him, not asking for anything, just standing there, waiting. Mark crouched down, resting his arms on his knees. He didn't reach out, just met Duke's gaze and let the moment sit. Then slowly, Duke stepped forward and nudged Mark's knee with his nose. Mark let out a slow breath, feeling something settle in his chest. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was trust. The next morning, Mark grabbed the leash from the hook by the door and gave it a testing tug. Duke sat by the entrance, watching with quiet interest. They hadn't tried this yet. The idea of putting anything around Duke's neck had felt like too much at first, but now Mark figured it was time. He knelt, holding the collar in his hand, letting Duke sniff it. The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't pull away. Mark worked slowly, slipping the collar over Duke's head. The dog tensed, then relaxed, exhaling softly. "Good boy," Mark murmured. The leash clicked into place, and Mark gave it a gentle tug. Duke hesitated, but followed when Mark opened the door. The morning air was crisp. The snow mostly melted now, leaving damp earth beneath their boots and paws. They walked down the driveway, Duke staying close. His movements were careful, measured not out of fear, just newness. Mark kept the leash loose, watching Duke's body language. The dog's nose twitched at the fresh scents, his ears flicking at distant sounds. Then, for the first time since Mark had found him, Duke's tail gave a small, hesitant wag. Mark smiled. Yeah, they were going to be just fine. Mark adjusted his grip on the leash as they moved along the dirt path behind the house. The ground was firm beneath his boots, the last patches of snow clinging stubbornly to shaded areas beneath the trees. Duke kept pace beside him, his steps steady, his ears flicking at the rustling branches overhead. They hadn't ventured far before, mostly sticking to the driveway or the edges of the yard. But today, Mark had decided to take a longer route, one that wove through the woods and looped back toward the house. Duke's posture had changed over the past few weeks. He no longer moved like something waiting for the world to turn against him. There was still caution in his steps, but it was different now, less like fear, more like awareness. The leash stayed slack between them. Duke's head turning slightly at the distant sound of a woodpecker hammering against a tree. He was taking everything in, absorbing the newness without shrinking from it. Mark glanced down, watching Duke's expression. His nose twitched as he caught a scent along the trail, and for the first time, he moved ahead slightly, leading instead of following. Mark let him. They walked in silence, the wind threading through the branches above, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Mark had taken this path countless times before, but this was the first time it felt different, like he wasn't just moving through it alone. Duke paused near the base of a fallen log, sniffing at the bark before stepping over it with careful precision. His muscles had filled out since that first night, his ribs no longer sharply visible beneath his coat. Mark stepped over the log after him, adjusting the leash as Duke picked up his pace slightly. The walk stretched on, the woods gradually thinning as they neared the back edge of the property. The sun had climbed higher, casting long streaks of light through the trees. As they reached the clearing near the house, Mark slowed, giving Duke a moment to take in the open space. The dog's tail moved slightly, not quite a full wag, but enough to show something had shifted. They stepped back onto solid ground, the house ahead of them. Mark unclipped the leash as they reached the porch, watching as Duke hesitated for only a second before trotting up the steps on his own. Inside, Mark set his keys on the counter, toeing off his boots. Duke settled near the doorway, his eyes still alert but no longer darting to every sound. Mark moved into the kitchen, filling a bowl with water before setting it down. Duke drank without hesitation, his movements fluid, comfortable. Something about that simple act struck Mark more than he expected. He leaned against the counter, watching as Duke finished, then stretched out near the couch, his body relaxed in a way it hadn't been before. Mark exhaled, rubbing his hand over his jaw. This wasn't temporary, it hadn't been for a while. Duke wasn't just surviving anymore, he was home,